Today, I want to talk about the problems that as an aggregator solves within the marketplace. And I want to start with an abstraction. As an aggregator, the concept, the operation, it's content curation, but it's also education. And we have three main pillars holding the whole thing up. Playlist theory for content consumers, playlist theory for content creators, and playlist theory for content curators. That's the triad. And I want to be clear from the jump that that's not a decorative structure, that's architectural. Each one of these tiers has its own problem set, its own failure modes, its own specific pressures. And the reason I'm starting here with the abstraction, with the triad, is because I think most conversations about content and curation skip past the thing that makes you care about any of it in the first place. They jump straight to the solution. They give you a tip, they give you a workflow, they give you a checklist, and they never actually stop to sit with the problem. So that's what we're going to do today. Now let's really think about this. What is the problem? For me as a content consumer, the problem was content consumption in and of itself. What am I watching? When am I watching? Where am I watching? Why am I watching? And more specifically, to what extent is any of this relevant as a part and as a whole in relation to my overall consume digest? Now, consume digest. Let me sit with that for a second because that term is doing real work here. Your consume digest is the full body of content that constitutes your intellectual diet on any given platform at any given time. It's not just your watch history, it's not just your subscription feed, it's the shape of what you consume, the pattern, the proportion, the texture of what you've been feeding your attention. Most people have one of these. Almost nobody has a name for it. And here's the thing. Before that higher order abstraction was concretized into a form described through the use and development of playlists within a cybernetic ecology of YouTube, and by cybernetic ecology, I mean YouTube as a living feedback responsive system, a system of content and attention and creator behavior and algorithmic mediation operating together. Before that, I wouldn't even have a word to describe something like a consume digest. That's not a small thing. The moment you have a word for something, you can actually be deliberate about it and you can deliberate about it. Before the word, you're reacting. You're moving forward by forces you can't name. So how are most people actually consuming content? Let me give you an honest picture of how most people are actually navigating YouTube right now. For the vast majority of people, the primary sourcing mechanism for their consume digest is the algorithm. You open up the app, you see what the recommendation engine surfaces, you click on it, or you swipe past it, and in the advent of shorts, it's only a swipe to the next, a swipe to the next, a swipe to the next, with a gap between your conscious intent and whatever outcome the platform has decided for you narrowed down to essentially nothing. There's a disintermediation of conscious intent because in how people source and curate their content. Because for all intents and purposes, their consume digest has been satisfied. Either they're being super served via the algorithm or because someone provided a hypergraph edge in the form of a link, a referral, a comment, a share. And either way, that selection wasn't theirs. It happened to them. I'm not framing this as a moral failure. The platform is engineered specifically to produce this outcome. The algorithm is optimizing for attention capture, not for the coherence of your intellectual life. And I'll also be remiss to not mention search, because search is one of the most powerful tools in your arsenal as a content consumer. Search is where active, directed, intentional consumption lives, where you arrive with a specific question and you extract from the cybernetic ecology of YouTube what you actually came for. But even then, the question returns. What do you do with what you find? Where does it go after you've watched it? How does it become part of a consumed digest you can actually navigate? That's the problem. The scale of the terrain. Infinite content. YouTube has a statistic. How much content gets uploaded every single minute. I believe the figure is somewhere around 3 million seconds of content per minute. Something in that neighborhood. And honestly, the precise number doesn't even matter. Because the point is that the volume is essentially incomprehensible at the individual level. Now, run through that in regard to your own specific niche, your own specific interests. Whatever intersection of domains you actually care about, that content, the content that exists relevant to those interests, is effectively infinite relative to any individual's capacity to consume it. And it keeps compounding. So what is the problem? The problem is infinite content. That's the load-bearing problem. Everything else in playlist theory is downstream of that. And the platform's solution to infinite content is to narrow the aperture for you automatically, which trades the overwhelm of abundance for the narrowness of the algorithmic prescription. Neither of those are what we're after. The consumer's problem in detail. Now let me get specific, let me get granular, because I think this only lands for people who are actually consuming content at a level where this registers as a real problem, not as a hypothetical one. You're watching a video, you're 15 minutes in. Maybe it's a 2-hour documentary, maybe it's a long-form interview, maybe it's a dense lecture that requires sustained attention. And then either in your subscription box or your home screen, another video surfaces. It reaches a certain threshold. It's relevant enough, interesting enough, time-sensitive enough that it registers as something you don't want to miss. What do you do? Do you click into it and lose your place in what you were currently watching? Do you scroll past it and hope the algorithm surfaces it again, knowing that's not guaranteed? Do you write it down? Do you open another app to note it? Or do you let it disappear into the noise of the feed, understanding that the feed is a river and anything you don't grab as it passes is gone? And here's a compounding problem on top of that. You're actively navigating the home screen or the subscription box. You've been scrolling for 45 minutes. The server hasn't refreshed yet, so the landscape you're looking at is the same landscape from when you sat down. Or maybe it has refreshed and the configuration is different and you're not sure whether you already processed what you're looking at or whether this is new territory. You're navigating a dynamic environment, simultaneously making decisions about what deserves your attention and when. How do you determine your content surface area when you're already consuming content? That's a first and foremost question. The doctrine that playlist theory provides for content consumers is, at its core, a set of decision rules for handling that exact friction. When a video surfaces that deserves your attention but doesn't merit interrupting your current line of reasoning, it's not urgent enough to switch to right now. You add it to one of these three structures. You add it to an ASAP playlist, a category-specific, immediately actionable queue of content-specific directives that are related to the decision to consume as soon as possible. Secondarily, you add it to a category-specific playlist, an indexed, itemized library organized around a domain of interest, geopolitics, financial history, whatever your actual taxonomy looks like. Or you add it to a temporal playlist, organized not by subject matter but by time period, a record of what you were consuming and why during a specific window of your life, sortable by date published, navigable as a kind of intellectual biography. Now there's a secondary option, less preferred but available. You just click into the video, navigate to your watch history, and let it sit there safely as a retrieved item. That works, but it's tricky, because clicking out of your current navigation context can trigger a server refresh. And if you were in the home screen, that refresh might change the configuration you were working with. You might lose the thread of what the algorithm was showing you. That's a real cost. What playlist theory offers is a framework for making these decisions clearly, without that cost. It turns the chaotic experience of navigating infinite content into a structured, deliberate, recoverable process. There's another problem embedded in high engagement content consumption that I want to name explicitly, because I think it's underutilized, under-theorized, even in conversations where content management comes up. You're watching a video, and someone says something, a keyword, a concept, a phrase, that triggers a line of inquiry. What I mean by that is a specific lexical or conceptual anchor becomes the entry point for a search through the semantic space of available content. You've been watching one thing, and something in that thing has created a new search intent, a new question, a new territory you want to explore. What do you do with that? Do you write down the keyword? Do you pause and search immediately, breaking your current consumption context? Do you trust yourself to remember it? Do you annotate it in a note-taking application and return to it later? These are not trivial decisions. They're micro-level decisions that, in aggregate, determine whether your consumed digest is coherent and directional or scattered and reactive. Playlist theory gives you the protocol for handling these moments, a doctrine that covers not just what to add to a playlist, but what to do when the video you're watching gestures towards something you haven't found yet. Now let's move to the second tier. Content creators have a different set of problems, and I want to be careful not to collapse them into the consumer's problems just because some of the vocabulary overlaps. Here's the central one. A creator with a library of 100 videos, 200 videos, 300 videos, to what extent have they laid out a structured path through that work for an end user who arrives knowing nothing? Have they created an architecture that takes someone from zero to their most recent content in a coherent, sequential, meaningful way? Or is the library just an uploaded videos playlist, everything in reverse chronological order, no internal logic, no beginning, no arc? And that question, whether a creator has built a content marketing operation, a systemic, deliberate infrastructure for guiding end users through a body of work, that's the question that separates channels that compound over time from channels that plateau. But how do you get to the problem? But the problem goes deeper than architecture. How do you tell your story as a creator? How do you take the largest, most amorphous thematic buckets in your work and break them down into individual stories that communicate not just the subject matter, but perspective, development, trajectory? How do you use playlists to establish your presence within the cybernetic ecology of YouTube itself? To create structures that invite your community to navigate, return to, share, rather than just a feed they passively consume. And there's a practical problem that tends to be overlooked. Voice search is coming. The SEO implications of playlist titles, descriptions, naming schemas, these are going to matter more, not less, as search behavior evolves. A creator who has built a thoughtful, systematically named playlist architecture will now be positioned differently in that landscape than one who hasn't. The titling schemas, the indexing, the written records, these aren't bureaucratic overhead, they're infrastructure investments. Playlist theory for content creators offers what we might call packaged, itemized structures. The static video anchor playlist, a curated fixed sequence of content designed to orient a new viewer within a specific domain, the category-specific deep dive, the narrative arc playlist that functions less like an index and more like a serialized argument. It can contain your videos, it can contain competitors' videos, or an amalgamation of two, and it can also be unlisted or listed. The question isn't just what structure to use, it's why, at what development cadence, and whether you can execute over time in a way that builds a coherent understanding with your end user base. The curator's problem: selection as value proposition. The third tier, and this is the one I find most interesting, the one I think is least understood. The content curator is not a content consumer who got organized, and not a content creator who chose not to produce. A content curator is a distinct role within the cybernetic ecology of YouTube. Someone whose value proposition is selection, indexing, framing, and distribution. Someone who provides what the algorithm cannot: conscious, discriminating, informed judgment about what deserves a viewer's attention and why. That role is becoming more valuable, not less. Here's why. We are at a point in the development of AI where the volume of generated content, not just on YouTube, but across every platform, is going to expand dramatically. The scarcity isn't going to be content. The scarcity is going to be synthesis, the capacity to cut through the noise, to identify what's actually worth consuming, to lay a trail for others to follow through the infinite scroll. That capacity is going to be in demand in a way that it hasn't been before. And the curator's problem is twofold. First, they need a system, a playlist management infrastructure robust enough to handle the volume and complexity of what they're tracking, category-specific structures, temporal records, all of the apparatus of playlist theory applied not just to personal consumption, but to the task of curating for an audience. The operational demands are higher, the organizational requirements are more stringent. They need to be able to translate their curation into something marketable. Can you transform your role as a content curator into a value proposition? Can you structure what you've built for yourself become the structure? Can the structure you've built for yourself become the product you offer to others? That's the question that connects playlist theory for curators to the broader concept of a content marketing operation. And it's the question I think most curators haven't fully reckoned with yet, because the vocabulary for it doesn't exist widely. The accumulation problem. Let me come back to the content consumer one more time. Even when I started developing intuitions that eventually became playlist theory, the closest thing that I had to a vocabulary for what I was doing was watched later, the playlist. That was the category. That was the structure. Everything I wanted to return to went into a single undifferentiated pile, and over time, depending on your velocity as a content consumer, that pile becomes a lot. It becomes unbearable. It becomes unmanageable. Do you let 1,000 videos accumulate in your watch later playlist over the course of 6 months? Or is there a better way? For me, the better way was to dig into the cybernetic ecology of YouTube and engage with the tools the platform actually provides, specifically the abstraction, and to use those tools with enough intentionality that they become a navigable map of your consumed digest rather than just holding a tank. Here's what that looks like once you've deployed the solution and you're actually living inside it. You're scrolling through your feed, making decisions in real time. Is this culture commentary? Is this natural science? Is this social science? Is this esoteric content? Is this defense and national security? Is this geopolitics? Is this financialization content? Is this blockchain related? So many different category-specific nuanced substrates that you may not even consciously recognize as distinct categories on a day-to-day basis because you're just consuming. But when you're curating, when you're making deliberate decisions about where each piece of content belongs, the taxonomy becomes visible. the structure emerges. And what emerges over time is stratigraphy, the layered, stratified record of your intellectual life as it developed, indexed by category, indexed by period, navigable in ways that raw watch history never allows. What the system reveals, backwards rationalization becomes evidence. Here's something I want to be honest about because I think it's load-bearing for understanding why this solution actually works. When I developed the indexing procedure, the practice of categorizing into ASAP, category-specific, and temporal playlists as a matter of regular discipline, I didn't fully anticipate what I would gain from it over time. The initial motivation was practical. Manage the volume, reduce the overwhelm, create structure. But what emerged over months of using the system was something I hadn't planned for. You can actually see what your consume digest looks like. Not just from your watch history, which is a raw chronological log that carries no interpretive structure, but from the playlists themselves. You can look at what's accumulating in your ASAP queue and understand what you've decided deserves immediate attention. You can look at your temporal playlist sorted by date added and read the intellectual texture of a specific period of your life, what you were tracking, what you were curious about, what the algorithm surfaced that you chose to preserve. You can look at your category-specific playlists and see in aggregate the shape of your interests. Not as you imagine them, but as your actual behavior reveals them. That's a different kind of self-knowledge. And it only becomes available once you've built the structure that makes it possible. Sometimes the algorithm surfaces a classic, something that was already there, always relevant to your interest, but that you've never found. When that happens, and you add it to a temporal playlist, you preserve the fact that you encountered it at this specific moment, in this specific context, with these specific other videos surrounding it. That's information. That's part of the record. As you develop the language to describe what was going on within your consume digest, to the extent that the algorithm super served you a banger, or to the extent that you searched for something and that video was in ecology, the whole time the structure is there to receive it. What problems are you actually having? I want to close with the questions that actually matter, not as rhetorical moves, as genuine diagnostics. Is your problem infinite content? The sense that there is more available than you could ever process and no way to make that abundance feel navigable rather than overwhelming? Is your problem an inability to differentiate your content consumption experience? Maybe even a substantial one, but no structure, no taxonomy, no way to understand what you've been consuming or why. Is it a recognition that we're at a moment in terms of AI, in terms of the content landscape, in terms of the value proposition of discernment, where the ability to cut through noise and layered trail for others is becoming genuinely marketable? And you feel that shift, but you don't have the infrastructure to participate in it just deliberately. Can you transform your role as a content curator to be able to provide value for others in a way that's marketable? These are the pressing questions of our day. And I believe that playlist theory, applied across all three tiers of the triad, honoring the distinct problem sets of consumers, creators, and curators, provides the most expedient path to answering them. Where this series goes, Part 2, Promise. I want to be explicit about one thing before we close. This is not a complete account. There are dimensions of this problem we've set and gestured towards without fully developing. The YouTube premium question, what it actually means from a content consumer standpoint to process advertising at volume and ratio that serious consumption demands, and what the psychic cost of that is in terms of not using YouTube Premium, that deserves its own treatment and it'll get one. There are also deeper layers to the consumer's problem that I haven't reached yet. The question of how much consumption is necessary before playlist theory registers as a genuine solution, before the friction is real enough to motivate the structural investment. That's a quantitative question I want to address with some rigor. And there are questions about the creators and curators' problems that remain genuinely open for me. The content marketing operation claiming what it looks like to fully professionalize a curation practice, to build a structure that's not just personally satisfying but commercially coherent, that's a live question. The thinking isn't finished. What I can say with confidence is this: the problem of infinite content is real. The disintermediation of conscious intent in how people source and manage their consume digest is accelerating. And the solution that playlist theory provides, not as a set of tips, but as a doctrine, a framework, a structured methodology for operating deliberately inside the cybernetic ecology of YouTube, is more necessary than it was when I first started developing it. Part 2 goes deeper into the consumer layer, specifically the velocity question, and what it actually looks like to deploy playlist theory at scale inside a serious, high-volume consumption practice. We'll get there. If you've enjoyed this overview of playlist theory for content consumers, playlist theory for content creators, and playlist theory for content curators, then check us out at Mr. Pollock 890. That's Mr. Polik 890. That is the home of our playlist archive channel. Go there, find some content you otherwise wouldn't have discovered. We're scrolling through some of the playlists. Check it out, consume content, get lost in YouTube again.